Recording in progress. 3, 2, 1. Hi everyone, welcome to episode 3 of the Engagement Lab podcast. I'm your host, Andrés Moreno, accompanied here by my other host, Jessie Del Fierro.
Hi.
So, session 3, technically halfway through the online sessions. I can't believe we're already here. How do you feel, Jessie?
I'm really excited. When we first started planning this and deciding what topics that we wanted to present to the group, this session was one of the ones that I was most excited about. And as you'll hear in this episode, it's about self-reflection and identity. We brought Amy Thompson and Evren Salja, who are two brilliant art-focused counselors. And
Yeah, I think it's going to be dope. I know in our conversations preparing for the session, Adrienne, one of our mentors, brought up the idea that the group doesn't necessarily know who they are or what their identity is as a group. So being able to bring in Amy and Evren, who can talk a little bit about identity, especially from a personal point of view, and then letting that hopefully permeate the conversations as a group about who the group is and what the identity of the group is, like who are we as a community. Forward in the group, and that it makes them start to think about like, what is the purpose of what we're doing here and who am I as part of that larger community purpose, right? Like that's my hope. Whether or not it'll happen, who knows? I think it's really interesting because I don't know if the same happened to you, Jessie, but it started to make me think about my identity as the quote unquote administrator of this whole experience and how what I do affects the group and how I can serve the group as opposed to like serve my own desires for the group. Does that make sense?
oh yeah, I fully agree. One of the harder lessons I am currently grappling with is what are my biases as an organizer and as a community member?
Yeah, I'm really excited to see how this session goes. But in our last couple of sessions, something I've been noticing, and Jessie, I think we've talked about this a little bit as well outside of the lab, but there's kind of a decrease in engagement. And I think part of it has to do with Zoom because Zoom is so hard and it can be exhausting for folks to sit on Zoom for long periods of time. But I'm also really curious what else might be going on that we don't know about that's causing that decrease in engagement. Some of the things we talk about in our check-ins and things like that are people are really tired. Some folks are working more than one job at a time. And I think that's kind of a recurring thing that we're starting to hear. This work is important to folks, but how do we make the time to do this work without it coming at a cost to our balancing and to our own internal needs?
Yeah, I'm hoping this session will touch upon how we prioritize our needs and how we prioritize the needs of others in service of community.
Yeah, it's honestly, I wish I had the answer. Sorry, you said that question and I was like, I wish I knew. I'm really excited, and I think the conversation that's coming up with Amy and Everin is such a beautiful one, and they're such like great minds and beautiful collaborators. I'm really excited to introduce them to our community as well and see how they kind of connect and vibe with each other.
Yeah.
The instructors that we brought in for this session were Amy, Eaman, Thompson, and Evren Salja, both great instructors, and we would love to welcome them into the space so they can introduce themselves for you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Eaman Amy Thompson. I'm coming from Kansas. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a woman of color with multiple intersecting identities. My formal education and training is in counseling and art therapy. I run an independent counseling practice and really focus on the areas of identity, grief, and trauma. Just they tend to coexist and really feed into one another. And so coming to this project felt like a nice, seamless transition into work that I'm already doing and seemed to really align with what I saw as being part of what was needed.
Thank you, Amy. Next up, Evren Salja, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, folks. My name's Evren. My pronouns are they, them. I'm queer, trans, non-binary, and a whole collection of Balkan identities, but I can for sure say that I'm a Kosovo refugee, which is how I've come to be on Turtle Island. I'm a narrative therapist, practitioner, living and working on the lands of the Squetnik to Kamloops peoples, also known as Kamloops, BC. And I came to this project by an invite actually from Amy. Was like, I think there are some folks and a particular project that you might jive with. So that was kind of it, and I'm very thrilled to be here.
Thank you both so much for your wonderful work in this session. What was your impetus for choosing to bring in the subject of identity into this session for this group?
I think it was actually Amy that zeroed in on identity as kind of the lowest common denominator, just a common denominator between the co-design questions and topics that you folks had shared with us. For me, the question about, there was one that was about risk and failure that was kind of like a magnet that would not let go of me until Amy and I touched base after, and she started talking. And then from there, being able to take a step back from said magnet for me, because what she was talking about was kind of like the foundational precursor to what I was seeing. So I was like, okay, that's a good, particularly valuable starting point.
And I think for me, the piece of identity was kind of seeded after the first conversation we had back in November, December of last year. And I'd had an idea of what to work with. I went to brought those questions of what folks were really looking for and hoping to get out of the workshop. The question that I actually really magnetized to, I guess, was the one around solidarity. And for me, creating, I'm going to use a theater analogy, but if you're telling a story and folks are on a stage, lights need to be somewhere. And where you place lighting has a huge impact on what folks are going to take away from the scene. The same way, if you're recording it, the position of the camera is going to really change things. And so to have conversations about risk, failure, solidarity, community, how do we support one another? Everyone needs to know where the other is standing. And so kind of like a production, you need to know where everybody is. And the conversations we had, and one of the other facilitators, Adrienne, she really touched on this piece of like, I don't know that the group knows what their identity is. We're still trying to figure that out. And so the seed had been planted after our first conversation, getting the questions, having the conversation with Adrienne, continuing those conversations with you. I was, this is the direction we move in. It's identity.
Gorgeous. Thank you. And just as context for the listeners, the questions that we offered for co-design was, what is intentional community action? What are the structures to create solidarity? What is one real action I could take to be more inclusive? What does support in risk and failure look like? How do different artists from different intersections support each other in sharing knowledge? And so keeping all of this in mind and understanding that the common denominator was identity, what were you hoping our participants would start to consider in this work?
So I think for myself, it's just becoming aware of all the other parts that are in the room. And as a woman of color, so, my family immigrated to Canada before I was born. So I was born here. I've traveled a ton, identify as a third culture kid. And that's an experience I've had in pretty much every space I've ever occupied. There has yet to be a room I've walked into where I haven't had to be like, who am I in relation to these folks? And in some ways, those answers were really clear. When I was in Egypt, it's like, these are my cousins. They are on my mother's side of the family. And this is the relationship I have to them. And this is how I fit in this space. And even if I don't look like the folks here, I'm connected in some way. And then when we moved to Canada, we were in Lloydminster, and it was a small town. We're just the only Arab. There was nobody else like us. And that was a very jarring experience of, I can't pinpoint anybody in this room who is like me. I couldn't speak the language. I had, the words cat, house, dog doesn't really help you communicate a whole lot. And so when we are in Canada, which folks like to say is a multicultural mosaic, I don't know how often folks who colonize this land are familiar with reflecting on the experience of the other, since a lot of what has made Canada what it is today has been the erasure of those things. So we like to say we're a multicultural mosaic, but outside of like a day, maybe somewhere celebrating, Greek culture, or we have a Chinatown, outside of those little pockets, I hesitate to call representation. I don't know how much folks consider those things. And so if you're not paying attention to who's in the room with you and what they're bringing into the room with you, how could you possibly begin to account for what their needs are, what respect looks like, and all of those other pieces. And so this workshop was really focused around the piece of how do you engage with the other people in the room? Are these things you think about? And if no, that's not the end of the world. Parts of your experience maybe have given you opportunities where you haven't. But also in that, what have you been missing out on in terms of the richness that every single person in the room can bring? And so that was really the experience for me. And the exercises that we did very much took folks from, here are some general words that we all have associations with. And then in that, we all had very different associations. Some were very similar. There was one I underlined a bunch of times because it came up a bunch of times. But then there were others that it was just a one-off personal association. And then from there, we shifted to like, okay, what words do you use to describe you? And are they there? And then really looking at how to relate that to others around you. Like if you use words that some people might be confused about, you have very specific definitions for words. Could that exist for somebody else? And then how do you navigate that? So yeah, that's what I was hoping folks would consider.
Before I hand it off to Evren, do you mind describing what that exercise was for us?
Yeah, so the labels exercise, one of the reasons I've been doing a variation of this exercise for a whole decade now. What I love about this workshop is it's very innocuous. We start with really benign words like Friday. You hear the word Friday, all of us have an association, whether it's TGIF, whether it's the movies, whether like there's so many things that come together, but each of us is also going to come with our own experiences of that. And as we turn up the temperature a little bit with the words that we choose, lazy, special, white, things start to get a little bit more charged. And so if language is this flexible and this malleable, Everett and I were joking as we were creating the slides about how there's some words that have been the same throughout time. And Everett's like, which one? And I was like, words have changed definition like a lot. And so just even looking at how nebulous that can become, unpacking just everyday words, like where did this come from? Why do we use this? How does it resonate with certain people, especially as someone who's lived in a bunch of different parts of the world? There's language use in the UK and in Australia that like we don't use here. And even as someone who speaks another language, some of the participants joined me after and started speaking to me in Arabic. And there was a part of me that's like, oh gosh, because some of the dialects, it's honestly like you're speaking a whole other language because it's reflective of all of the different languages, histories that have moved through that region. And so like, yes, we speak Arabic, but I might say halla for pot and somebody else might say tanja. And there's like no similarity between those two words. So recognizing that language is super abstract and socially defined and socially constructed and starting to unpack those pieces, like that activity alone, we could have actually fleshed that out for the entirety of the workshop and really looking at the intersections between the words too. So we put up the words and then we take words that didn't fit when we put up the next word and seeing how some things were connected, like between Friday and white, and then other words just, thanks for trying. We can't connect these two words in our head. And that's okay. But just also seeing that there are these constellations. And so it's hard to look at something in isolation when there's all these variables in place. So yeah, that's more about that activity in particular.
Thank you for breaking that down. Evren, was there something you'd like to add about what you hoped that the participants would consider by bringing this subject into the group?
Yeah. So in addition to what Amy was mentioning, one of the things that kind of came to mind for me was, are you aware of what's in your own metaphorical or literal home and backyard before we're in a position to really start looking at anyone else's landscape? And then from there, inviting folks to kind of get used to having some of those considerations and ask questions. For many people, especially if you've had access to privilege at whatever degree, when was the last time you did have a chance to check in with yourself about your own space, your own location, your own identity? And then in some of these tidbits, inviting folks to have a bit of space to do that, and then ask them, what was it like to have an opportunity to familiarize or refamiliarize yourself with your own context, with your own identity and follow up and offer them a few different spaces there. Was that tough? Was that easy? What might be transferable or helpful to keep in mind based on your own process when you're getting to know another person's space? Then scaling that up and saying, okay, so what about when you have an entire group's worth of spaces to get to know? And then there's also the collective. So you're looking at many individual people and spaces. And then what about the group's collective space? So it's a series of progressions to invite people to consider, kind of like slow it down, have a moment to look at where are you sitting? What are you looking at? And then scale that from there onwards with, of course, holding buffer space, because you are not the center of the universe, even if your point of view is such.
Thank you. I still think I'm the center of the universe. I'm just going to say, I'm just kidding.
You're the center of my universe.
You're the center of my universe. Okay, sorry.
I'm feeling the love here. I'm feeling the love.
There's a lot of love in the work that we do. We need it.
It comes across.
Thank you. From doing the work with the group, what were kind of things that you noticed from the participants?
The one thing that kept coming to mind for me was I was hands down not prepared for folks to want to engage and ask questions and share their experiences. I facilitated a few groups before, and I would offer a question or a consideration. It would be crickets. So based on that, like, okay, I will have things ready to be able to offer people as examples. And I remember talking through one of the pieces right after the identity or the labels activity and offering some of mine. And folks were like, yeah, I have questions for you. Like, you asked me to consider these things. I'm like, oh wow, we did not budget the time for this. I'm thrilled. And I feel a little bit bad that we didn't budget time for this. So of all the things to notice or like to be caught off guard by, it was wonderful to have that be the thing. So yeah, I think that's kind of the one that's standing out the most for me.
I think on my end, very similar to what Evren shared. I think we posted the first label and like I looked up at the chat and there were 74 responses. I was like, we're not going to have enough time. But it's never a good way to start a presentation, but also sort of horrible way. So it was lovely to see the engagement that was present. Yeah, and I think part of it is like, it's really hard to predict who's going to come into the space, which is just reflective of this exact process that we're talking about. And one of the things that was really interesting for me to see was that there were some folks in the room who were like so ready to have this conversation. They're like, oh my God, yes, I'm ready to talk about this. I want to talk about labels. I want to talk about all these things that I haven't had a chance to talk about. And then there were others in the room who were like, this is what is a label? How do I engage with this? And again, this is Zoom. So I'm just reading body language and cues and not really knowing. And I think just seeing how stark of a contrast there was in the room and how much folks were willing to share. And there were folks who talked themselves through the process. It was probably one of my favorite comments. Evren threw out a question of like, what affords you the power to ask me these things? I was like, well, you shared it. Wait, consent, actually, and just going through and some of these assumptions that folks have. And it was lovely to see just even the trust that was in the room to be able to go through that process in a room of a bunch of people. So there is some degree of trust in the room, which is lovely. That's the foundation of any sort of identity forming, but just that there was a spectrum of experiences in the space. And I think one of the things that I love about doing this work is people think identity is a static thing. And I've been doing this workshop for the labels part of it anyway for 10 years. Who I was 10 years ago doing the workshop is completely different from who I am now. That's okay. And this comes back to that like magnetic question of risk or failure. I think so many folks are scared to engage in this work and scared to engage in this process because they're going to find out that they maybe have been doing some things that are not super helpful. But then how do you move forward if you don't sit with those parts that are a little bit? Even at the start of those conversations, there was like, hey, terminology, try this, try that. And noticing that, but I've tried really hard to like get this right. And that's okay. I am just going to continually make mistakes. clearly I need to go do more research and read about stuff. And I'm open to doing all of that and being open to go through that process and knowing that you can't get it right all the time. And like, you might meet one person who is totally okay with something, but you can't extrapolate that experience onto every other person. Just recognizing that each individual is an individual. Who you meet today of me might be someone different than who you meet in a week, because I'm also engaging with a bunch of different things all the time. And that's going to force me to continually reassess. Yeah, could just keep the cycle indefinitely. So that was the really cool thing for me, to just see the disparity in the group. There was a little bit of trust, and then also some of the hesitation around engaging with this process of like packing what that is.
That is so exciting. Thank you. And you spoke on so much about what this engagement lab is about self-reflection and taking the risk to make mistakes. And also the fact that we are all on different points in our journey. And so I'm curious, when you mentioned hesitations, and I also want to put the opposite of it, of what the excitement is. Did you notice any specific barriers or moments in the work that felt particularly difficult or hesitant? And what part of the work was really exciting and brought a lot of curiosity and joy? What were the barriers and patterns that you noticed? I also want to echo that you brought in this beautiful exercise about the faces that we bring to the work that we do. And I would love if you could talk us through what that looked like and what you noticed in that exercise. When I was observing, there definitely felt like a lot to say in that exercise, but a lot of hesitation and deep reflective work that was going on in the space. So I'd love to hear more about what you noticed.
I admit that my contribution to like the noticing piece might be very brief in no small part because I get very overwhelmed with multiple inputs. My strengths are more to do with like one-to-one conversations, part of how my brain works or what I'm able to process. There is one thing that I was kind of wondering by way of like a barrier to engagement is when I noticed when we were sharing the screen via Zoom, like there's a part of me that's wondering if the hesitation or the distance from folks might have been in a small part to do with the technology, because I know that when we're sharing a screen, it's very difficult to see all of the participants. And I know that not everyone is as familiar with how Zoom functions. So some folks were raising their hands physically, which we may not have been able to actually see in time to actually engage with. I know that Zoom has like part of the program is that if you use some of the gestures, then it keeps people up top automatically. So not sure if folks are not familiar or if they're using a different device than what they usually do, because I've come across this challenge before where Zoom on my laptop is different from my iPad, is different from my phone. So there's a part of it that I was kind of wondering, could this be part of the hesitation or part of the spacing for some folks or barrier to engagement? But yeah, that's what I have access to in terms of recollection. Amy, I think you have a better or more skilled eye at attending to a number of things simultaneously. So I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, part of my art therapy training is to kind of like gauge where folks are in the room. I think one of the things that I was really struck by with that faces activity, one side of the sheet of paper is the face they put to the world, and the other side is the parts of themselves they maybe don't share, and seeing if there's alignment between those two pieces was just the number of heads that went down immediately to engage with the activity. There were a lot of folks, I'd say the majority of folks jumped right into that activity. And then it was in the moment where like, okay, and they'll come up that I could see folks being like, there is alignment or there isn't alignment. And for some folks, that was something they were very familiar with. And I think for some other folks in the room, that was something they were less familiar with. And so that was kind of how I was gauging folks' responses and how they interacted with the prompts that were given for discussion. I'm also mindful we ran out of time. So in my experience between technology and time, when I've done variations of these kinds of activities, some of those folks that take a little bit longer kind of like listen to what's out there, and then they're like, oh, this is a thing that exists for other people, and then they feel a little bit more comfortable sharing some of the things that are showing up for them. But I know what it's like to have parts of yourself that you don't share and having to reconcile what does that mean? Like, who am I serving when I don't share these parts of myself? Am I doing this to protect myself in some spaces? Am I doing it to serve things? And really having to sit with what all of that means can be quite heavy. So a very simple activity, pen and paper, can provoke a lot of reflection if folks are willing to go there. And if this workshop was the first or second or maybe third time that you've done that in your life, then yeah, that's going to feel uncomfortable, especially when there are other people in the room who are like, oh yeah, this is all the ways that I camouflage and mask myself and do all these things. Just recognizing that for folks who are having to camouflage or code switch or mask, then this is something they're familiar with. Know just the toll it takes on them. Whereas folks who don't have to think about that, or the parts that they don't share aren't foundational parts of their identity, might not carry the same weight.
And if I may add to that, that also leads us into the final exercise that y'all offer, which was the identity wheel. Correct me if I'm wrong. And something that I'm curious with, because these exercises tied in so beautifully, did you notice sort of an arc overall in the workshop of the label, the deep reflection, the face exercise, and then the identity wheel? Were there patterns of engagement that you noticed across all three exercises? What prompted folks to dive in and really dig deep into this work? And also, what did people see that were like, oh, okay, maybe I'll just take this a bit slower and dip my toe in the water? I'm also curious because at the beginning of the workshop, you offered the question, can you notice when other people are uncomfortable? And I think that is a theme that we're engaging with in the engagement lab.
Lots of layers here, Jesse. So we're going to try and parse through. There was very intentional design between the activities because labels, everyone's like, oh yeah, totally. I can think of things off the top of my head, and then turn those labels towards yourself. Like, okay, hold up. This is different, but I can deal with it. And so the analogy often used is like you toe in the water, and then you have your feet in the water. And then by the time we got to the identity wheel, you're sitting in the water, and it's not the temperature you'd like to be sitting in. So it's that moment of adjustment. And I think even for folks who may have engaged a little bit with the masks activity, who've engaged in some part of that process and were familiar with it, the identity wheel is still a jarring experience because it's looking at all of these intersections that we so often take for granted in our day-to-day interactions. And then going through that process of coming up with all of those things for yourself and then being like, okay, that was hard. I most certainly am not doing this in most spaces. Then to be like, oh, I should be trying on some level to do this for folks I'm engaging with. My mind's a little blown. I don't know if I'm in the place to do this right now. And there's a lot here. And there's a lot of different experience in the room. So I remember one of the comments in the chat was someone who's like, I tried this all the time. And that's, to me, I'm like, you've been through some shit and you've worked through some of it. And I don't know if I can swear, so I apologize if I can't. This process of reflection, you don't have to go to a workshop to do it. Life will put you in circumstances where you don't have a choice but to engage with these things. And some folks can go a very long time in their life without having to engage with these concepts. It can be a very jarring experience when they're faced with it for the first time. Whereas other folks have been dealing with this since the first time they recognized they were different. And so that was also why different was a lot of the works we had, because there's a different degree of engagement with those pieces. And in a space that had as much participation as there was, I can see how if you're someone who hasn't engaged with these things as much, it might be harder to give voice to that, because then all of a sudden the tables are turned and you're like, I don't feel like I know how to comment on this. I feel like this cold water is a lot colder for me than somebody else who has been in this wading pool a few times. And just like any temperature of water that you get into, we acclimate. So the thing with discomfort is it can't last forever. It's how do you regulate and stay with yourself through that process of discomfort enough to be able to recognize the other folks who are having to do this all the time, existing in spaces of discomfort. Because I think that's really what it comes from is being able to sit with your own discomfort and your own pain. And only then can we truly have the capacity to look across a room and be like, oh, hey, you're in a cold pool too. What's your cold pool like? and having that degree of engagement. But if you're not even aware, like if you've just been dipping your toe in the whole time and everybody else is like waist deep in this very cold water, your experiences are going to be very different. And of course, you're going to be like, yeah, that's not that bad. You just have to dip your toe in. Whereas you're like, yeah, I don't have a choice though. Like the water started at McCranch. That's where I started. So also recognizing proverbially that we're all in different bodies of water. And this is an analogy I use quite often in my practice. Some folks are in a pool that is covered and shaded, and then other people are out in the ocean. The experience is going to be very different based upon the privileges you have, the access you have to certain things. You have to manually swim 50 kilometers to get to dry land. Whereas if you're in a pool and you just like hop out and you're nice and dry, how you engage with the world is going to be very different. So I think I answered all the questions you asked, Jesse, but feel free to let me know if I've missed.
Amy, I don't think you missed anything that was thorough and actually gave me more of a chance to be like, wait, what are the questions? What am I thinking? And as you were talking, like, a couple things that I was able to recall, it was really interesting to see it start to click for some people, or some people just got into it. Like, okay, so it actually takes quite a bit. It's one heck of a practice to go about, like, what are the different pieces of my identity in the identity wheel. And then Amy kind of took them and we're like, okay, so now the last one, we started here. And by the time you're at the full circle, you need to consider, here's your context. Now shift your context and work backwards. What's different? And then people were like, oh. And then from there, we're like, okay, so if that's tough, now consider that you're doing that for every other person. Think about how much time and how much energy and how much capacity and skill is required to actually attend to that degree of space and scope when you're considering other people. And I think throughout the workshop, the thing that was important to us was the scaling piece. So Amy was saying, some folks dip a toe in. Some folks are like, okay, I'm at my ankles. It's a little bit uncomfortable. And some people like, started at my crotch and now it's at my waist and it seems to be climbing. So this is not the same thing. And 100% it is not the same thing. And the scalable piece in inviting everyone, especially when you're thinking like, you don't know who's in the space. You're like, okay, so if you have an experience of at your ankles, it was uncomfortable. What was that discomfort? Now, given that what you know of that, how do you think it might be? This is not necessarily going to actually translate, and you might never get this experience, but how do you think it would be to travel all the way up, or for it to just be shoved in waist deep? And that's when people are able to be like, oh, okay, so this was uncomfortable. I'd wager it's probably going to be more uncomfortable. And then start thinking like, how do people navigate this? What's the experience? And that's the piece that we're trying to invite people to have a sense of. Don't stop at the, oh, it's different. Like, yeah, absolutely. That's not the ending point. And if you look at like, oh, it's different, and you start looking at other people and be like, wow, you're so inspirational. And it's kind of like a running thing at this point. I swear to every God, if someone tells me I'm resilient one more time. So it's inviting folks to kind of take a step. We're like, okay, so acknowledging that this is different. What's the in-between space? What might it be like? And then engage with that with some curiosity. Take a chance. You don't need to know. You don't need to assume. Like, if you are making an assumption, those can be valuable. Do you have a practice of checking that with respect and dignity to other people? And then Jesse, you were asking, how do you figure like it resonated with folks? I have no idea. I am very curious about this. So if you have insights, I'd also be very curious about what feedback folks may have offered about this, or may do so later on if they're willing to share.
And I'll quickly answer that and then throw it back to Amy. The interesting thing is that we built into the engagement that the opportunity to debrief with each other. We offer that in privacy and confidentiality so that there isn't the power dynamic and they can share freely. So we're also very curious about how this resonated, and we're curious about how we continue that conversation so that can build. And that will lead us to the next question. But Amy, I saw you had something to add.
Just had one very small point about something Evren was saying. If you're at your ankles or you're at your toe and somebody's waist deep, can you imagine what that's like? Also recognizing that imagining what something's like is different than experiencing it, and being okay that this gap exists. There is a very strong, I don't don't know if it's the right words, but like a need to know. Like I want to validate that this is a thing that's happening. I want to understand it. I want to like get into it. And the reality is with the systems that are in place and the way our society is structured, you may never know what that's like, right? There's all those like icebreaker questions. What would you do if you had $1 million? Or what would you do if you won the lottery or whatever? We can all imagine what it would be like to be rich, but it's not the same thing as being rich. And that's a very crude example of what it's like to be another person, to have all of their history, to have all of their memories, to have all of their experiences, and to try to reduce that into something that you can imagine is hard for me to sit with. And so that's something that we touched on quite a bit in the workshop, this piece around humility, of wanting to engage with this gap, but doing so in a way that doesn't reduce the person in front of you to whatever you're imagining in your head, because that is pretty foundational. And this isn't to say that you're not going to do it, right? So this is why I love working with Everett, because they're like, oh, I'm curious for feedback. And I'm super curious for feedback too. And there's also the part of me that's like, if we were horrible, we would have heard of it. And that's just my experience of doing workshops and doing groups, is people are very vocal if things are horrible. So up until now, I think we've done great. If I find out otherwise, I will humbly accept that and do what I can to shift it.
Let me tell you, from our perspective, it was a great session. It was so wonderful to be able to just witness it and see it all happening. Now, you've both touched on this a little bit in your answers to the last question, but what do you kind of wish, or do you have an impetus of what the next steps would be with this group now that you've kind of brought in this question of identity and the labels and all of those activities? Like, is there anything you think that the group is hungry for moving forward?
So one of the things that's kind of coming to mind, and one of the things that I deeply appreciated about how we were invited to develop this particular workshop, is that you already had the questions and like the engagement prior to, and you're like, okay, so this is what the group is wanting and needing and identified for themselves. So with that as background and context, like I have no definitive ideas to just be able to copy paste and be like, this will absolutely work. It very much depends on what folks were able to take from what we offered, how they were able to integrate it, and where it might be sitting with them as a group or as a whole. I know that one of the things that we kind of touched on or gave folks a bit of a snippet of was around questions. And this is, I think, a pretty commonly known thing about me at this point. I love questions, and I love the like working on the skill in crafting questions. It sounds deceptively simple when I say it like that, but the behind the scenes work is substantial, which I figure folks who are doing theater work have a sense of, just metaphorically speaking, like the amount of work that it takes to put something together is beyond what most people who are just engaging with the finished product can really think of. But yeah, I think we left folks with the tidbit about asking good questions in support of humility, as well as the navigating of like risk, failure pieces, and a bunch of other things. And we also offered them like, here's some examples of some pretty bad questions that have been thrown our way between myself and Amy. So I think it might be welcome or worthwhile at some point or any point to kind of follow up with a more in-depth look at the practice and be like, hey, so here's a scalable way of how you looked at identity and how you're considering other people. Would you like a scalable version of what it means to ask questions? Because every question has its own background of assumptions or values or things that are implied but not necessarily explicit. And oh boy, do folks who experience marginalization know about what is absent but implied, especially if it's in service of colonialism, capitalism, etc. We have an ear and eye for it. So yeah, something along those lines, I think might be of service.
Thank you.
I think for myself, I'll go with an analogy I gave earlier of the theater. It is now like, now that you have this information, situate yourself. Putting on a production, it's a lot of moving pieces. So if you're creating this group, what do those moving pieces look like? Every single person in the room that you have will bring strengths. There's a reason each person is in the group. There's a reason that they're engaging with this work. So what are the strengths that you can bring from every person? We take it to my other analogy of putting yourself in the water, recognizing that those strengths are there. Then what do you fashion for one another? Right? Is there a way to make a pool deeper for someone? Is there a way to build a raft for somebody? How do you play with the resources and tools that you have in the space that can help folks reach their goals? And then we started with 5 questions and recognizing, are those questions going to evolve now that you have this information? If we're talking about risk or failure, were those questions the most important ones to start with? Are there other ones that if you backtrack a little bit could help get y'all to a place where you are answering some of those questions in a way that speaks more closely or in a way that's more aligned with all of the voices in the room? And so, yeah, just taking the pieces here, scaling them, and the work I do with folks, I'm always like, take whatever you want of what I've given you or leave whatever doesn't work. So take any parts of this and make it your own. Don't be afraid to experiment with where it needs to go. Because I assure you, the identity wheel did not look that way the first time I put it together. It's gone through a lot of iterations, and being okay with that process, and also being humbly aware that this is not the last iteration. So just being okay with that, and that the identity of the group and the work that you're doing can continue to evolve based upon what shows up in the work. All of this is inherently iterative.
Thank you so much for your thoughts today. Honestly, working with both of you has been such a pleasure and an honor for both of us. I think one of the biggest joys for myself, at least I'll speak, and I think Jesse, you can back me up if this is also true to you, but there's so much knowledge that is being shared within the folks who are helping us bring all of this to our group. And I think that that's such a joy to be able to meet folks that I hadn't known of before and be able to kind of create not only a friendship, but also just this kind of like, I'll use this word, but like mentorship. You're teaching as alongside as we're building. And it's just this beautiful community that we're starting to build of folks who are all willing to do this work. So thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts, seriously, for being a part of this project with us and for all of the wisdom that you brought into this session for our group.
And just to add something that still sticks with me is at the beginning of the workshop, we had those word progressions. And the one word that stuck was joy. And getting to work with y'all was just a beautiful example of how, yes, this work can be uncomfortable and there's discomfort and it can be difficult, but it doesn't have to be painful. There can be joy and excitement and curiosity in this work. And that was such an honor to be involved with y'all. So thank you.
Honestly, I don't have as much as I talk most of the time. It's just been such a, I don't even have like honor to even begin to cover it. This has been such an incredible experience for myself. And, after meeting with y'all for the first time, like sitting with even some of the conversations we had at that point were kind of uncomfortable, and trusting like we're all in this for similar reasons and wanting to really hit the needle, whatever analogy you want to use. And so for me, it's just been such a humbling experience to do what I love doing, bring in folks that I love doing this with, and then gain more folks in the process of it. It's been really lovely to see the community we've built and just the respect and mutual love and just all of the goodness from the few meetings we've had. Because realistically, we've spent like 10 hours together, maybe a little bit more. And we've come a long way in that time. So it's just been such a treat. And I really, again, I'm so Like the first time I engaged with y'all, I was like, I'm so glad you guys are spearheading this work and doing this because it's so needed and it is hard, but it can be fun. You can talk about the discomfort like sitting in a cold pool, and then it's fun because it's the pool. So yeah, it's just been it's been a joy. It's just honestly been such a lovely process. I'm so grateful and just humbled because y'all have been lovely. Group's been lovely. Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm done.
Thank you. Thank
So
you
good.
so much. On that note, I just want to thank everybody who was listening. We also want to thank, oh gosh, give me a second. Do we have the sponsor sheet in front of us, Jesse? I will record this later, record sponsorship. But other than that, thank you all for joining us. Stay tuned to figure out what else happens in this wacky path that we're on with the Engagement Lab. And we look forward to talking next time. Have a wonderful day.
And with love.
And with love. Okay. Bye.